I'm Sheila Marr. First of all, I'd like to thank you for reading Pearls. That's great. I'm really happy that Kate has introduced it to you and that you're all gathered there to talk about it. That kind of thing is always exciting for me, and I'm sorry that I couldn't actually be there because I think that would be super cool. But Nelson is a little far away, so here I am virtually. Kate has asked me to just tell you a little bit about Mongolia and my trip there and the whole making of pearls. So here we go. I went to Mongolia because I'd dreamed about doing it for 40 years. When I was, or almost 40 years, when I was 12, I watched a movie, a ridiculous movie actually, about Genghis Khan, and it was starring Omar Sharif because at the time Omar Sharif was about as exotic and ethnic as it got in Hollywood. So that movie somehow, although watching it today, it was totally crazy and badly done and with terrible costumes and James Mason imitating a Chinaman and all kinds of really appalling things. At the time, when I was 10 or 12, it was incredibly exciting, and the whole notion of Genghis Khan in Mongolia just completely captivated me. And in fact, I ended up making some really nerdy cartoons with a friend that involved Genghis and his horses and thundering across the steppes of Mongolia and basically, marauding and stuff. So for some reason, it really struck a chord with me, and I harbored this idea of going to Mongolia and galloping across the steppes on a horse for my entire life. And it wasn't really possible for a long time because of the communist rule and getting into Mongolia and of course just in general it was far away and life goes on and I got married and had kids and jobs and blah blah blah. So I kept not doing it. And then as I was about to turn 50, I thought, geez, I've had this dream for 40 years, and 40 years is a long time to hang on to a dream. Like, when it's been around for that long, it's not going away. So I thought, once I turn 50, it's not going to get any easier to sleep on the ground and ride a horse all day and do that kind of stuff. So I better do it while I'm still actually capable of getting up off the ground in the morning, getting back in the saddle. So I made it my 50th birthday present to myself. I left the kids behind with my husband. I found a company called Bujum, and they were one of the few companies who had actually been in Mongolia, and both the Chinese part and the proper Republic of Mongolia, quite a bit. They had managed to take a National Geographic team across the country, so I figured if they could do that, they could probably handle one competent horsewoman. So I chose them, and they put together a program for me. I flew into Ulaanbaatar. I had an absolutely grueling jeep ride to the center of Mongolia, which was only about 300 kilometers, but took 11 hours, dodging camels and all kinds of stuff on the road, and the road would disappear. You'd have some potted asphalt for a while, and then it would disappear altogether, and we'd take off across the countryside and roar across the hills, and then the road would eventually reappear, and we'd get back on it. And you were just doing this the entire time. And when we got finally to our destination in the center, I was there. There was a jeep driver who carried supplies, and then I had my translator, who was a woman, and she had parents living there. So we slept on the floor of her parents' house, and their house was basically a wooden shack with no running water and an outhouse and a central stove and very little furniture. So we bedded down there, and they were very generous, and they fed us and all this kind of stuff. And then we took off the next day. We met the guide and got our horses and started traipsing around in the middle of Mongolia in the steppes. So that's the Khangai region. So I was in all the areas that I wrote about in the book. and Ikatemir and all those places. We did some wonderful things. I mean, it was an incredible trip. It surpassed even 4 decades of fantasizing about it. It was even better, which is pretty extraordinary. And I did things like go to the Naadam Festival, and at that time, people like me were really, really rare still in the middle of Mongolia. So little kids would gather around and kind of stare at you and touch you and stuff because you were like odd. But everybody was incredibly friendly, and they'd take you into their gairs, and they'd feed you these wonderful dairy products made with yak's milk for the most part. Sometimes mare's milk, sometimes sheep, but not very often. So there were a variety of different animals that they kept, of course, and it was basically meat in the winter and dairy in the summer, and that's like no vegetables, no fruits ever. So they would bring me in and they'd feed me all this yummy stuff, and in particular this incredible vodka that they made out of fermented yak's milk, which just blew the top of your head off. And it was drunk from a communal cup, so they'd pass it around, and you'd take a sip, and then you'd pass it with a quarter turn, and then the next person would drink out of it. And there was no way there'd be germs because that stuff was like a bazillion proof and would have killed anything that anybody had in their lips. So that's how you drank vodka. And every time we arrived in a new spot for the night, we would set up a camp and a campfire, and so this is like you're washing in streams, and we were, the guys would shoot, God, what are they, a gopher for dinner, and we would throw rocks in the river to push fish towards a net, and that's how we did fishing. And so while we did have some supplies with us, there was also that aspect to it. So we'd set up a campfire, and then people would just magically appear, because with 1.8 people for every kilometer, and that's including the city center. So out there, it's incredibly sparse. People would hear about this white person traveling through their area, and they'd all come, and the babies and grandmothers and everything in between, and they'd all sit around the campfire, and we'd sing. And I'd sing Canadian songs like "I's the Buy That Builds the Boat," and they'd sing their Mongolian songs, and the guide taught me a Mongolian song, and then he was very proud that I could actually sing this thing in their language, which I've heard described as sounding as though two cats are fighting. It's just like tick, 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 tick. Anyway, I managed to learn the song, and then he would parade me in front of all these Mongolians and say, she could sing the song. She could sing. It was a very popular song that summer, so I would do my little dog and pony thing. And one of the other things that really sticks in my mind was after an evening around the campfire of way too much of this vodka, the guys, the jeep driver and the guide decided that they would like me to teach them how to polka. But we had no music, so I sang while teaching these guys how to polka when we were all like quite thoroughly out of our minds. Anyway, that was the fun part of the Mongolian trip. And at one point, we were in that area of the Qinghai, the southern part, where it's all dusty and there's just like nothing there. And we came upon this temple in the middle of nowhere with one lone monk. And that's the temple that is on the cover of the book. It's from a photo that I took while we were there. And so we started talking, and he talked about this whole business of how there had been a huge monastery there, but it had been razed to the ground in Stalin's time, and the monks had fled or been murdered. And he talked about how they had fled into the hills and how there were caves up in the hills where they hid. So we rode up into the hills and tied up our horses and walked the last little bit and went into these caves that had scratchings on it of the scripture and little stupas carved out and things like that. And it just made your hair stand on end being in that space. So it was a story and a piece of history that I literally stumbled upon totally by accident. And yet it was so compelling and so incredible because who knew about that stuff? Like I certainly didn't have any idea about that history. So when I went home, which was Italy at the time, I was living in Milan with my family, I started researching it. And up to that point, I had been writing about lust and love in Italy and just, not topics like this at all. I would never have imagined myself writing about the slaughter of a bunch of Mongolian Buddhist monks and the resulting life of one of the survivors. It just was like, are you kidding me? No, I don't do that stuff. But somehow the story had kind of put itself in my path, and so I felt compelled to write it as much as anything else, and I started researching it. And that was quite challenging at the time because although there was internet, there wasn't a lot of internet like there is now. And almost all of the resources that there were that dealt with the history of the period, they were in Cyrillic or in Tibetan, but they certainly weren't in English. So finding materials about anything was really incredibly hard. But I eventually stumbled upon the University of Indiana, of all places. Who knew? They have an incredible Mongolian studies department. And so I would write back and forth to them, and I'd order stuff, essays and books and all kinds of things, books on history, essays on the slaughter, the whole politics throughout that entire period that I wrote about, books of folk tales, books of proverbs, so all those little proverbs at the beginnings of each chapter. Those are all from a book of Mongolian proverbs, researching the names and what they meant. And then Buddhism. I knew zero about Buddhism, let alone the Mongolian variety, which is quite particular and not at all like Zen or Tibetan Buddhism. It's kind of its own brand. And so I had to figure out how that whole thing worked, obviously, and how the artists did their art, and about the whole cult of Tara. And so that was more books and more research to figure out all that stuff. So it took me 8 years to write Pearls, and about 3 of that, I guess, was the initial research in order to put it together so that it would be true. So it's a fictional account, but everything that happens in the book that is historical, not the people, but the events of melting down giant Buddhas and the massacres and the hiding in the hills and having to grow your hair out and then all the events along the way, the reopening of the monastery in Ulaanbaatar, the exodus from the countryside, what they did with farming and collectivization and all of those things, they're all true. But Dash's life, of course, is not, although I like to think that it is representative of the truth, and that there was a monk like him who lived that way and who had the same decisions as he had once everything freed up again. Because the monk that I had met talked about how they had hidden their valuable little statues and scriptures and stuff for all that time in their gairs, in the floorboards, at great risk for themselves, and that when and various other hiding places, and that when things opened up again, they went and found their things and were rebuilding their old monasteries brick by brick with very little help and almost no funding. So it's just an incredible story, and that's why I want to tell it. So then I had some help in writing it because I felt so compelled to write it, as opposed to, hey, this would be fun. You know, it clearly wasn't kind of fun to write, but it was really incredibly interesting to write. And because I really wanted to make sure that I did a good job of telling Dash's story, because he became like really dear to me, you know, as though he were a real person, and deserved to have his story told to the best of my abilities. So I had some help along the way. I sought the advice of Karen Connolly, who writes a lot about Burma, and so I knew that she would know my subject matter and what I was trying to get at with the book, and she helped me a ton to really make the book much better. So many of those 8 years were involved in rewriting and rewriting and rewriting the thing, and adding detail, and just bringing the story to life. So that's about it. Let me just see here. I made a couple of notes so I wouldn't forget stuff. And yeah, that's about it. So I hope I've told you some things that you find interesting. I've kind of blathered on for 16 minutes, so I hope that wasn't too long. And have fun, and thanks so much for reading it. And please tell Kate what you think about it, because I'd love to hear. Or write a review on Goodreads or on Amazon or wherever you feel comfortable. That is always greatly appreciated by authors. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.